In my other gaming life, certainly I'm an enthusiast of role-playing games, especially Dungeons and Dragons. And often there is such a crossover between wargaming and role-playing D&D gaming. So naturally, being a board gaming enthusiast, what about the Dungeons and Dragons Adventure Series board games? Literally, how do they stack up? And in terms of a dungeon crawler, how do they play? That's what I kind of wanted to focus on in this vlog, answering the question, exploring the question. And this is true of any title. If I pick up this game, is this something that I'm going to regularly play? Or will I play it a few times, then it'll sit there on my gaming shelf and just kind of taunt me all the time? And especially if you're a D&D enthusiast, you can never get enough D&D. Naturally, you ask, is this a board game that I would play? Perhaps you're a pure D&D player and you're thinking about jumping into board games. If you're a dungeon crawler enthusiast like I am, how do they stack up? So the first thing with these series, they are series in that it's almost like an adventure module. They have a backstory, they have different missions, they have a campaign. The monsters and the boss monsters that you fight against are kind of based on that narrative. So different boxes will have different dungeons to explore and different scenarios, but they all still use the same rule set. And the rule set is kind of a streamlined 4th edition D&D. You've got some cards and powers that you utilize. They're going to be very familiar in terms of abilities and feats and attacks if you've played Dungeons and Dragons. The monsters are going to be very familiar with their attacks and their feats. And essentially, it's a simplified D20 DC check system. And I say simplified, I don't mean that in a negative way. It has to be simplified because it's trying to deliver that Dungeons and Dragons flavor in a board game experience. So if you're playing D&D and you understand D&D, it's going to be very, very familiar. If you're new to D&D or you're just jumping into the series, the rules are very, very approachable. They play very, very fast. There's not going to be any problems with that. Being the adventure series means the positive is that each one of these series not only shares the same rule set, but you can completely mix and match characters, monsters. You have the player characters that you get to pick from. The rules will work with any of the adventure sets. So you can take the heroes from one adventure set, play them in another. Likewise, the monsters that you spawn, while they're themed for that box and that adventure, you could totally take monsters from the other box sets and incorporate them randomly into the set that you're playing. This is kind of interesting because what this means is while every single set is standalone, at the same time, since they can be combined, they're also kind of like big box expansions. You can really build a very, very big D&D world out of all of these, almost kind of jumping from one adventure to another, almost like taking the character that you want to enjoy playing and playing them through the entire series. So with that framework, how does the game play itself? Well, on the positive side, it is a completely randomized dungeon. Everything is totally random. And I have to say that the random system, while there's not a lot of bells and whistles and kind of dressing, it works very, very well. The scenario will have an objective at the end. It might mean make it to this room and escape the dungeon. It might be find this boss and defeat the boss. It might mean encounter these 2 rooms and collect the artifacts and then escape. But essentially, you take an objective tile, dungeon tile, cardboard tiles, and put that at the bottom of a deck. And then you take 6 to 9 or 10 other random dungeon tiles, mix them in, which means you're going to get through a bunch of random dungeon tiles, and then at some point, the end encounter is going to spawn. You put down the start of the dungeon tile, and based on where you want to go, you flip these tiles over and over. It builds a very, very fast, clean, completely random, almost old school roguelike dungeon. Now, the downside to this is there's not much interaction in the regular dungeon rooms. There will be places where monsters spawn. There might be some custom rooms where if they pull out while they're not the primary dungeon room, something will happen on there, but it's kind of bland. There's no furniture, there's no interaction. You're just kind of wandering around a random dungeon, fighting monsters and making it to the end objective. This works for what it is. On a side note, let's talk about miniatures for a moment. These are familiar D&D miniatures that match up to the source books. They paint up pretty well, and certainly the dungeon tiles, what I've done is take some dungeon furniture, some boxes, some barrels, some broken up chests, some bookcases, piles of rocks and stuff like that, painted those up, and I add them to the tiles as they spawn out. They don't interact with the game in any way. Certainly you can house rule it, but the idea is with the painted miniatures, the tiles, and this kind of dungeon dressing furniture, it kind of spruces it up. It really looks like a nice 3D dungeon, and the fact that it plays fast works very well. Now, as monsters spawn, they spawn randomly, and they're going to be themed based on the box. There's spawn points on these tiles. Some will spawn a monster, some will not spawn a monster. When they spawn, there's a simple but effective AI. Move towards this target and attack, move away from the target, attack ranged, move towards the target, block this, and then attack that. It works, and they have powers, and it's a difficulty-based D20 check. You fight the monsters. When you defeat the monster, you gain experience to level up. You also instantly gain treasure. Now, treasure could be, depending on the box, it could be gold, it could be healing potions, it could be familiar magic items from the D&D game that you can now utilize. So the leveling up and the magic item acquisition does happen very fast. But there's this feeling of going through and exploring a dungeon, leveling up, getting gear, and having a boss monster in a pretty quick play package. That simplistic formula, I find, works very, very well. Now, let's talk about the one thing that I really don't like about the series, and I think as soon as you can accept it, it works kind of okay, but sometimes it's a little bit of a grind, and sometimes it's a little bit of a punishment. So we've got this end dungeon objective where we're trying to accomplish something. But this is a living dungeon. There's monsters, there's traps. As you move through the dungeon, not only do monsters spawn, but there's also an event card. And these event cards could be something like a trap in the room that maybe you disarm or you can try to dodge. It could be an event that happens in the distance where now more monsters spawn. It could be a hazard where a magical effect happens. Usually it's stuff that causes damage, and it's not always avoidable. The flavor text is there, but it sometimes feels like it's a constant fight against these environmental cards. I enter a room, I flip a card. Spikes hit me, 2 hit points of damage. Okay, I move to the next room. Just a magical trap effects. I'm dazed and I take 2 points of damage. Okay, something happens in the distance. Another monster spawns because an alarm sounds. Hey, that's kind of cool. I move to the next tile. Oh, it's another trap. I take 2 points of damage. It's this constant race against losing hit points, trying to gain hit points and get to the end. I like the idea of the environmental cards, and some of them are better than others depending on the set. But some of them, most of them, are just kind of a grind. And it doesn't make me feel like I'm in a dungeon. It makes me feel like I'm bookkeeping, watching my hit points. Nothing says you can't customize. If you kind of go out and buy the different adventure sets and adventure series in the game, you can custom build an event deck where it's true events, like traps that literally trap you in a cage, spawn monsters, spawn a merchant, spawn different opportunities. You can customize. But for the most part, the decks just randomly deal out damage, trying to make you feel like you're in a dungeon. I like the theory of it. It doesn't quite deliver. And for that reason, it sometimes feels like a grind. But if you take those cards out, you're missing an important component of the game. So, is this a game that you would regularly play? I have the sets painted up. I have the sets with some furniture, some dungeon furniture and miniatures. They look nice. They play fast. Some scenarios are better than others, but what I do like about the game is that there are a number of mini-boss and mega-boss fights against iconic D&D monsters, beholders, vampire lords, dragons, giants. It's kind of neat to get to battle those, to run through a couple of quick play dungeon adventures, level up, get some gear, and battle those. I also like the fact that you can combine these sets and have essentially beyond infinite replayability. And even in the core sets themselves, based on the random dungeon and how they spawn out, the game is going to be different every single time. How do I think it plays best? Well, when I bring a game to the gaming club, a dungeon crawler, it's usually not going to be Descent First Edition, simply because that's a major commitment. That's like TI Twilight Imperium. One doesn't just play Descent First Edition. It's very, very complicated. It's a great game, but it's complicated. Likewise, when I bring Hero Quest, that means I'm probably playing the Overlord, the Necromancer, Zargon. I don't mind doing that, but it's going to be one against many. What I like about the D&D series is that it's a cooperative game. It's you and your friends having an adventure, a D&D adventure, playing against the randomness of the dungeon, the monsters that spawn, and the combinations of your characters. I think that works very, very well. It's also has that D&D flavor, but in a good way. It is very simplified and streamlined and plays very, very fast. Setup is quick. The box organizes well. Some of the end bigger adventures will last a while, but for the most part, most of the adventures, including boss fights, they're about 45 minutes to an hour of quick play. I find that works very, very well if you just feel like a dungeon crawler where you want to make a couple of tactical decisions in terms of powers, but you just want to kind of see how the story and how the dungeon unfolds and have that boss encounter, that boss fight at the end to see how that plays out. I find the game works very, very well with new players or board gamers with limited dungeon crawler experience. It's not overwhelming. You manage a couple of powers with your character, you get some gear, you level up, you make some decisions. It works on a very, very simplified, quick play level. And that I believe is the price of admission. That's the design behind it, to give you a quick play D&D experience. It is not a complex dungeon crawler. It is not a multi-character management level up type dungeon crawler. So if you're looking for that, absolutely a completely different system. But if you're looking for a plug and play with a lot of replayability, and if you like the series being able to instantly pick up the other modules, the other adventure series, and mix and match and play different characters, that, in my opinion, is the massive strength of the series.